Welcome to another in the series of Idea Collider, a series of conversations with pharma's innovation leaders. This week I'm delighted to welcome Daphne Zohar, followed for a long time. She's listed on Wikipedia as an American entrepreneur, and she's absolutely that. She is the founder and CEO of PureTech Health, a biotech company, which was founded went public in June 2015, and is a FTSE 250 company. She's often listed amongst the most influential voices in healthcare, and certainly acknowledged, many times over as one of the most influential women in biotech. So I'm delighted to welcome Daphne to the podcast. Specifically, I think the thing that I'd be really interested in is your pivot from kind of VC to pipeline, and I'd love to hear more about your journey.
Yeah, well, we started with a $100,000 check from an angel investor. So we really bootstrapped the creation of our pipeline. And in order to do that, we realized that it makes sense to, at the time, what we did was we partnered with venture capital funds to fund the development of new medicines in our pipeline. And the way that we did that was we created subsidiaries and we put the intellectual property into those subsidiaries. But that created, I think, a perception in the community that we were some form of venture capital firm. But we've always really been an operating company. The team at PureTech has identified, invented, developed the programs, the underlying platforms that form the basis of now 24 products and product candidates, of which 2 have now received FDA clearance and EU marketing clearance. 14 are clinical stage. So it's been a different way to develop a pipeline of new medicines. And there's, you asked about innovation, and I think one of the interesting things for PureTech is we don't have a problem of not being innovative enough. We have a problem that we're so innovative that I think there's not really any company in the world quite like us. So there's a pattern recognition question of, who are we like? And we are sort of a hybrid between a venture creation type of an entity. You look at, companies like Arch, who we've worked with, or what Atlas sometimes does, and Third Rock, and so on. But we're an operating company. So we have our own labs. We have a chief scientific officer. We have a clinical operations team. We're running experiments. And so I think it's different. And we view ourselves more as a biopharmaceutical company.
Interesting. And what was that first $100,000 check? What were you setting out to do at that point?
So it's really interesting if you think about how a lot of biotech companies get started. They're started by somebody who has conviction around a specific technology platform or focus area, and then they're looking for problems to address with that technology platform. And the best entrepreneurs and scientists get funded, and then there's attrition along the way as you run these growing experiments, including binary publicly traded science experiments. So the idea was to work together with leading experts to deconstruct a particular therapeutic area, disease unmet need. So you're working with the people who've really thought most deeply about the problem, and in a modality agnostic way, you're looking at what's the leading science happening in different academic labs. What has the pharma industry tried to do in the past, and what are some of the issues they've run into? Could you go after some sub-problems? And then the idea behind PureTech was really that we would be sort of an institutional version of an entrepreneur. And, often investors will say, we bet on the jockey, not the horse. But who's really looking at what's the best horse? So the idea was that we would be sort of an institutional version of the jockey, and we would be spending a lot of time figuring out what's the best horse. That's sort of the idea behind PureTech. This concept of a lack of bias, this concept of we're going to do the experiment that killed the project early. And actually, you'd be surprised how much resistance there is to killing a project early, and also as it moves on, even more resistance. So setting up the experiment that's going to address whatever the key point of skepticism is, and doing that experiment pretty early on.
Yeah, and interesting. So, and just help me. So PureTech it's essentially with 24 pipeline and programs. This is set up so there's a run as subsidiaries. So there you have development teams that are focused on their own technology rather than a kind of traditional pyramid approach to being a pharma company.
Yeah, so initially when we had this model of partnering with venture capital funds to develop the medicines, we would put the IP in a subsidiary company, but we were really the core inventors working with academics and identifying and developing that early program. And I can give a few examples. Like in the case of Karuna, we were running that program up until about 2 years ago. So we were doing the experiments, and then we brought in Steve Paul and Arch and some of the other folks that then took that program forward. So in the case of the programs that are being developed in founded entities that we created, those are essentially at some point being run just like any other company. In the beginning, we control and manage them, and then over time, there's teams in place and they control and manage those. In the case of our internal pipeline, which is a pretty new development for us, we started working on it a couple of years ago. We have now 5 different programs, but they're all based on interrelated biology of the lymphatic system and immune cell trafficking. And that's now clinical stage. And that's wholly owned, completely developed by us, just like any biotech company would be doing.
Yeah. So if you're... Yeah, a little bit. So, and if you're out there on your own, why do you expect that there'll be others, or do you expect to pivot one way or the other? Because this kind of misperception, I guess, of you as a VC.
Well, what's interesting is there's some new companies that have taken different approaches to developing medicines that are not as binary as a traditional biotech. So, for example, BridgeBio, Schrödinger. And even Royalty Pharma, even though they're not really, they're sort of looking to identify interesting assets. But this concept that there's publicly traded companies that are not just developing one sort of pipeline program, that are not pharma companies, traditional pharma companies. I think that's
yeah, for sure. And you used a really interesting word there, skepticism. So, because I think a lot of pharma programs are invested with belief rather than skepticism. And it's almost like proof of belief rather than proof of skepticism. So can you elaborate a little bit more on your skepticism, cynicism as part of the process?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in skeptics. I like having skeptics around. I've tried to hone the ability to be a skeptic because I think by nature, entrepreneurs tend to be more optimists, more can-do, like problem solvers. The skepticism, I think the best and most interesting things happen when you get together people who are really creative and who are thinking differently. And if you think about innovation, the key to that is actually thinking about something differently and doing something differently. And then you get together the people who will say all the reasons why it's going to fail. That's when I think magic happens, because that's when you can really think about, okay, well, what would it take to convince the skeptics? You can run an experiment. And we have a number of examples where we've done that with entirely new modalities. I think that there's a tendency to sort of fall into one camp, but that sort of combination is really the most exciting space to be.
Yeah, which is interesting. So, and that must be embedded culturally, right? Because the idea that that you want to convince someone who is skeptical is not what happens in the traditional sort of development process. But you must accept at the same time the possibility of failing to do that is part of that. Is that something that the company is comfortable with?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think part of the way that we're set up is that we can move our resources to the programs that are successful. And so we're set up to kill programs. And the ones that sort of survive this process are ones that we're really excited about and that have gone through this sort of test of fire. Really, we've done that experiment that could have killed it and it went well, or it didn't go well and we shut it down, and then we never have to talk about it or think about it anymore.
Yeah. Does it ever pop back up in a different form, or do you find some sort of evolution of the idea or the program, some kind of serendipitous journey that it takes? So non-linear.
It's interesting because if you're an entrepreneur, you have to sort of fight for your ideas. And so this concept of being willing to kill something early, it almost seems like, in contrast to what you hear when you hear about stories of persistence, being an entrepreneur. But I think that if you define in advance what it's going to take to convince you that this doesn't have promise, you set some very high standards and you're honest with yourself about what you'd like to see. Then when you get the results, it's easier to make a decision. Now, because science, it's biology, sometimes you're surprised by the results and they lead you down a different path. But then it's a different experiment. You're looking at it fresh and you're looking at everything else you could do with your resources. So if you're the CEO of a company and you only have one thing you're developing, I think there's a tendency not to have the same kind of discipline as you would have if you can direct your resources to other projects.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is relevant that we've come to, which I think could be relevant to others in the industry, is this concept of being willing to move resources around, not having a management team come together around one platform and then dismantle when that platform doesn't prove itself.
Yeah.
But actually having that management team incentivized to find the right solutions and to follow the science.
Yeah, interesting. And is that part of the PureTech kind of DNA, this, I guess, efficiency and effectiveness in the allocation of resources? Is that something that you learned in the sort of bootstrapping era, or is that something that's been imported from other places?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's something you learn through bootstrapping, this concept of being, really disciplined with your time and your resources. But I think that it's something that would benefit, any company. We've looked back at our success rates in terms of, the percent success rate from preclinical to clinical, phase 1 to 2, phase 2 to 3, and we've been able to do really much better than industry averages.
Okay.
I think that has to do with the discipline early on, and also with starting in that unbiased way with signals of human efficacy, and a real conviction about, the modality, its potential use, and its ability to address a major need.
And just to help everyone, I know I've been to your space in Boston, but is PureTech set up largely virtual, or is it physical, or and how have you managed the transition to 2020 and the challenges it presents?
Yeah. We actually have our own labs, and we've moved. I think you were at our space beforehand. Now we have an R&D facility. So in terms of the biology, some of that exists internally, some of that exists through our academic partners, and some of that actually, we don't reinvent the wheel. If there's a contract research organization that has certain capabilities, we will work with them and rely on their expertise as well.
And transition to 2020 and the challenges it presents has been smooth or rocky, or?
I think that it's been very, I think it's been a hard year for a lot of people. For us, it hasn't been, I think as impactful as one would think, in a negative way. I think in many ways, for me, it's been really enlightening to see how well the team has worked together virtually. How much we're able to accomplish as a team, even though we don't see each other every day. I mean, obviously the Zoom video conference helps a lot. And we are looking to see where we can make an impact. So we haven't had a huge negative impact from a business perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about, the world and, things that are happening outside of our organization. But I think one of the things that's exciting in terms of biopharma is the ability to really make a difference and see how the scientific community clinicians, everybody comes together and we can move things forward. In fact, that's a lot of what we do, in our process is we're looking to solve a problem. We're working with leading experts. We're exploring different approaches. We've been doing that increasingly through the lens of immunology and the lymphatic system, but it's something that's basically defined everything we've done, whether it be, Karuna or Akili, which is developing the first digital therapeutic, which is now approved. Gelysis, the first mechanotherapeutic, which is orally administered but acts mechanically, which again is now approved. This idea of being willing to open, to try new things, I think is something that, has been part of our DNA, as you say.
Yeah. So on the subject of innovation specifically, do you have a kind of working definition of innovation?
We don't really have a working definition of innovation. I think that it's one of those things where, for us, it's being willing to put aside any biases in the way that you think about solving a problem, really kind of diving into the problem and then thinking about what's the best way that one could tackle it. And then that's combined with, looking out to the academic community and seeing what other people are doing. So we build on knowledge and expertise, but we're coming at it from, some working hypotheses that are generated through our group of experts, through our team. And, for me, I think the key in that is being willing to put aside a bias. Most people, when they're solving a problem, they, it's sort of like A, B, C. Innovation or creativity, it's that, wait, why are you going to C? Why don't you go to Z? Or why don't you, why do you think that you're going down the path that's obvious? And I think in this industry, there is this pattern recognition that exists through the investment ecosystem, through a lot of things, where despite there being a big focus on innovation, it's innovation within the construct that you're expecting. So,
yeah. No, I think
it takes a little bit of bravery to not fall into that construct.
Yeah, it's interesting because I often talk about the separation between invention, the kind of initial idea, and then the innovation to take something forward. And I think that this attachment to the being right early, the kind of possessor of all knowledge. I know this is going to work, and I'm going to prove it's going to work. There's a lot staked on some people's opinions that something's going to work instead of finding out or proving them wrong. So I think that's an interesting flip on that idea.
Yeah, and it's interesting also because there are people in big pharma companies who can build a career saying no a lot because everything fails. I mean, it's just an industry where we have a lot of failures. Yeah. So somebody can look really smart by saying no. And you want those people there, especially if they're not just saying no to say no, because that helps you figure out, what you need to prove, or what are the things that would convince those people. I think that tends to happen is people either say no, they sort of listen to those people and then they give up, or they listen to other people and they sort of convince themselves and sort of drink their own Kool-Aid. But this concept of not giving up on an idea until you've done that critical experiment, I think is pretty.
And I think that you're exactly right that I've observed before on the podcast that, for example, if you work in regulatory and large pharma, there is literally zero incentive for you to take any risk, because you could say no 5 days a week for 20 years and never put the company in a position of getting dinged at the regulator. Because you said no, if you said yes once and made a mistake, suddenly that's problematic. So the incentive structures actually argue for the absence of the kind of culture that you're describing.
Right, and I think that creating that environment in an organization where people feel safe, making a mistake and admitting it, and actually coming forth and talking about those mistakes and figuring out how do you go from there, that's critical. Because if somebody's worried about protecting a previous decision, they're not going to be making the best decisions going forward.
Hmm. Or I guess you raised this earlier, that admitting that some of what you think is uncertain, that I'm 75% sure, but actually there's a 25% chance I'm wrong. That's a different cultural approach as well.
Yeah, it is. And, we're in this business of doing, doing something I think that's on the one hand very brave, that could have a huge impact, but also has a huge amount of uncertainty, and the willingness to be open to and open to criticism, open to outside criticism. That also takes bravery, and I think that if you're just in the business of protecting your own ego and your own reputation, you're not going to make good decisions. And so
Yeah.
that's, from a cultural perspective, that comes from, the leadership of the team, but it permeates throughout the organization. And we have a large company that's takes itself too seriously. It's not going to help promote innovation.
Yeah. So would you say, in approaching innovation as a process, would you regard PureTech as, more critical, self-critical, or more, because a lot of management theory moves towards, people being nice to each other in teams and, being constructive and so forth. Is that how do you see the internal culture?
Oh, it's highly self-critical, but it's not in a way that feels uncomfortable, not in a way that feels hostile. So, everybody will say, here's what I think. They'll be willing to take in feedback from others. And even if you're wrong, you don't, it's so what? You're wrong. Everybody's wrong.
Mm.
You listen to, what other people are saying. You admit when you're wrong. There was a really great example of that. Steven Salzberg on Twitter yesterday. He came forth with this idea, and he came forward and he said, "I made a mistake. I was wrong." And it's like, you never hear that. And he got such wonderful feedback for doing that.
Yeah.
Because for some reason, our culture has created this myth of always being right, and
Yeah.
that's not a good thing.
Yeah, and omniscient, so right about everything, rather than right with a particular opinion, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. So do you in PureTech approach innovation as an active process, or is it a little bit organic, a little bit actively managed?
Well, I mean, I think we have we have some strategic imperatives that drive what we're doing. We start, with disease focus, with a certain area of biology where we have the leadership position and expertise. But the process itself leaves open the ability to pursue ideas that we might not already be working on or thinking about.
Mm.
So there's that open-mindedness to new ideas, but you can't just pivot all the time. So, for a number of years, we've been developing expertise in this area of the brain immune gut axis, but I would call it like big with a big I. It's basically immunology, immune centric perspective on the big axis, and in particular, the lymphatic system. So that yields a whole bunch of new ideas. And then some of the ideas might be related, but might not fall squarely into that bucket. And so, really the lens we're looking at is, does it address, big medical need? Is it innovative, meaning that we can protect it? It's differentiated. It's not me too.
Mm.
I think if we have a bias, it's a bias against me too. And, nothing that we're doing is something that, there's other people doing.
And how does that work across? So you mentioned Akili, which I think for those folks who don't know is essentially a digital therapeutic, right?
Yeah.
So your range is diverse in many ways.
Right. So when we were first starting PureTech, and we were starting Akili and Genesis and some of the other founded entities, we were focused on big disease areas. So in the case of Corona, we started with a group of schizophrenia experts, and really were asking people, what's the most interesting approach you've seen? And people kept coming back to xanomeline, and then our team members came up with this idea of overcoming some of the tolerability issues with this muscarinic agonist-antagonist combination In the case of Akili, we were focused on cognition and attention and how could you modulate it broadly in the population without, with a approach that might be more experience driven. So the idea there was to look at digital therapeutics. The work that we did in those areas led us to focus on the brain immune gut axis. So it wasn't that we initially started with the brain immune gut axis. We started learning about the microbiome, the gut epithelial barrier, the lymphatic system, and some of the key crosstalk that's happening. And so in our internal pipeline, once we had the resources to develop our own pipeline, we honed in on the immune system and the lymphatic system, which is basically part of the brain immune gut axis.
Yeah, and with something like that, how do you know that it's making progress? So with something like a digital therapeutic, where there's a lot of open questions about things like the commercial opportunity, the regulatory environment, the kind of technology working. Is there, is it intuitive? Is there a kind of active process of measuring progress?
Yeah, so in the case of Akili, this is one of those examples where, the board members at PureTech and our R&D committee were very skeptical. You can imagine the first time that we said we want to take this video game concept and develop it for pediatric ADHD. So, the key experiments that we set up to run in that case, the key experiment was this pivotal study where the active control was basically another video game that was designed by the same designers and where Akili met the primary endpoint. So that was a really high bar given the success rates in CNS studies in general, and the fact that you were putting forth another video game. But the idea was really to address the key point of skepticism, where people just think, okay, well, if you're doing something that you believe is going to work, that is delivered, so like a word game, that was really the active control. That the reason why it's working, or are you just getting better at a specific task? And so we looked at standard tests of attention that weren't related to the game. In the case of Akili, there's also questions about how do you roll out, could you get FDA approval for such a thing? How do you roll out a digital therapeutic in the population? But the idea is really that you're starting from an unmet need. I'm a parent of a child with ADHD. So, when you think about the parents and doctors, if you speak to them, and there was a lot of market research that went into this, there's a hesitance to prescribe medicine, and some kids just aren't well controlled with meds. So the idea was to develop an alternative that could be for the less severe population, or for those where medication isn't helping. So you're addressing a specific need, and that actually turns out to be a big percentage of a big population. So when you're looking at the market, you're thinking about all those things.
So then you're also looking at other ways to, because you've also got to innovate the commercial model and a bunch of other things at the same time, as just following the pharmaceutical model through, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, when you start with the big need that you're addressing, you've made your life easier. So you're not just starting with something that's incrementally better, but you're really solving a problem that exists, that you've defined, and that you're trying to go after.
Yeah. And I'm assuming 24 is not the limit for PureTech in terms of the number of programs. Is there a scale? What does your scaling look like?
Yeah. So the key thing for PureTech is we have shifted, once we had the capability and the resources, primarily the resources, to take some of these programs forward ourselves. The default shifted. Initially, the default was we were going to put the IP into a subsidiary and find partners to help us fund it. So we changed that. And so in the case of our internal pipeline, there's 5 different platforms that we've licensed in, invented, that we're developing internally. Those could have been 5 newcos. The difference is that they're in one area of interrelated biology. So it's all basically related to immunology and the lymphatic system. And as we're developing additional programs and doing pipeline expansion, the idea is that the default is that we're going to be developing those ourselves. So you won't expect to see that we're going to be spinning up companies from that. We might, spin out some subset of programs. We might, partner specific programs, but the default is that we're developing those internally.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, cool. And so, in terms of your background, how you got here, what have been your learnings across, stepping into healthcare and then getting to today? What have been your big insights over that time?
Well, I think healthcare is a really interesting place to come into if you're not from, the traditional background and you don't look like every other CEO in the industry. And that again comes back to the pattern recognition. So, on the one hand, there's been people who have been extremely helpful and open-minded and have really helped. Uh, you know, on the other hand, I think it's not an easy path. Um, if you don't come from if you don't look like everybody else and you're not
Mm-hmm.
sort of checking the box. But I hope that there's more success stories, that we will help to serve as sort of the patterns that, can be leveraged for the next generation of leaders. And I believe that if you start with the best people and you go to them with an idea, they're actually much more open than people who are sort of mid-stage in their career. You don't have anything to prove. So I was lucky in the early days that I met some people who are really at the top of their career, and they recognized a good idea, and they recognized the quality and the mission of what we were trying to do, and they helped to open up their Rolodexes and helped, because like I said, we started with, $100,000, no network, no technology, no people. So we really built it from the ground up, and probably the hardest, longest way that you could create any sort of biopharma enterprise. But the thing that I was fortunate enough to have, and that's continued throughout, is just working with some of the best people in the world.
And do you think that the future of the pharma industry is more monolithic, or do you think it's more, more pure techs and diversity in that way?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what we're building, we've been building a pharma company, but it's a pharma company of the future. It doesn't look like Pfizer. It's been really productive. It's been really efficient. We built it with very little capital initially, but we've now taken ideas and brought them all the way through. And I think there's going to be others like that. I mentioned a few other examples. So, yeah, I definitely feel like the industry has tried. The big pharma companies have tried to create innovative little centers of excellence, and you've been part of a lot of those discussions yourself. But it's a question of incentive. It's a question of the environment and the ability to execute quickly on an idea, where the barriers to execution scale with the amount of money that you're putting. So you can actually do, at PureTech, somebody could come with any idea. Bernat came up with this idea of looking at the microbiome and the immune, microbiome crosstalk. He was, out of his postdoc, new to PureTech. He had his MBA postdoc, was working on the team, and said, I want to look at this. And he was able to do that. And now he's running, I think one of the most exciting immunology microbiome companies. And he could do that because we don't have the barriers when you're not spending a lot of money. And I think that the pharma companies, what I've seen is that the barriers don't necessarily scale down. So it's hard to really explore new ideas in a nimble way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one conversation we had on the podcast was about how relatively impermeable pharma is to new ideas, right? So, where would you go if you were a microbiome idea into most pharma companies? They might not have a silo that could evaluate it, and certainly you're a lot of layers away from a real decision maker. So a lot of people have got to be convinced before it comes in. But so is there a kind of pure tech engine that someone can kind of benefit from, when they're approaching the organization? Do you want to remain impermeable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some extent the strategy makes it a little bit, it doesn't make us open to everything. So if somebody comes and says, we want you to invest in our company, that's not our strategy. We're not an investor. In fact, we've never been an investor.
Mm-hmm.
We got founders equity. We basically created these new programs and we initially owned 100%. So we did allocate some resources to them. So if somebody came to us and said, I want to invest in your Series A, we want you to invest in our Series A. That's just not relevant. But if somebody comes to us with a new idea or a medicine that is, within the realm of strategy and expertise that we have, I would think and hope that we'd be as open as possible to those ideas.
Mm.
I think the other place where we're really open is identifying young, talented people. And they don't have to be young, but like people who have an enormous amount of talent and creativity and enabling them to reach whatever heights they're able to reach. So somebody, I think we have, we're very proud of taking people right out of their postdoc and training them, and working with them in this entrepreneurial setting such that they are then running a company or running an important program for us internally. So I think taking a chance on people is probably just as important. Being able to identify talent.
Mm. And that's a good insight, right? Which is often, those young talented people have one piece of the jigsaw, and they need some people that have been around been around the industry a little bit, know how to do some things, because often they're alone in the startup. They're missing that kind of, that bouncing off, experience and expertise.
Absolutely. And it's, it's something that it's hard to define in advance.
Hmm.
And I like to think that I benefited from that when I was early in my career, that I had people who were open and willing to see, the talent that existed, or the potential that existed. And I think that we're proud of the fact that we've been able to do that. And I'm not sure that, I'm not saying that there are many talented people in large pharmaceutical companies, but I think that sometimes those individuals can get lost.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to not be, I don't want to say, I don't know if it's maverick or whatever. They tend to not be the people who sit and do the politically correct thing. They could be frustrated in, certain settings. So it's identifying who are those people versus somebody who just might be a troublemaker or just might disagree with it. It's not.
Yeah,
It's
and
easier said than
certainly and Safi Bacall talks about that kind of, if you're a drop of water landing on a big ice cube, it's, you just get turned into ice quickly. I think the idea that people who are talented with good ideas will thrive in a large organization is, I think we all know what happens to those people. So I'm interested. What drives you personally? What has always driven you, and what's driving you now?
I think that it's interesting because it changes over time. I excited about and driven by, what we're doing in specific disease areas, and to be able to advance new treatments for patients. And I know that sounds like a cliche because every, biotech CEO is probably driven by that. And in fact, many of us, I think, are driven by that because we have individuals in our families who, we're passionate about helping, or, there's a lot of mission-driven work in biotech. I don't think I'm unique in that way. Another thing that I think drives me is just, I think you're a musician. I think artists and musicians and creators, you have this drive to just create something that is good, that is, I don't know if the word is perfect, but it's sort of just something that you're creating that you're proud of, that brings together the very best of what you can do, what other people can do. Sort of like composing, a beautiful song or creating something. And I think that is probably, one of the drivers as well. Just doing things right, doing things the best they can be done.
So is there, I guess, in any given week, do you feel like you're winning, or do you get that kind of satisfaction regularly, or are you waiting for a big moment? Or,
Um, I think it's more when you look back
hmm,
and you see what you've accomplished.
hmm,
You feel that way, but I think in the near term, probably again not unique to any CEO.
hmm,
You're always focused on what problem you can solve and what's going wrong, and what's your next goal, the thing that you're trying to accomplish. So you spend a lot of time sort of forward looking, but every once in a while you look back and you can feel proud of um, doing these things that are really things that you're proud of, but also doing it in a way that you're proud of in terms of um, being good to people, being
yeah,
honest, thinking long term and not short term. Those are the things that I'm most proud of. I look back and I you know, just feel good about how I've treated people. So,
yeah. Yeah, I was just reminded of there's a comment that the guy who wrote The Martian, the movie The Martian, is it The Martian, the one with where he's trying to figure out how to get back, and he said, well, there's an interesting thing because at the point he's being interviewed, he said, look, this is feels successful, right? But there's never a point at which you feel like you've won because you write the book gets optioned, it's going to get made into a movie. Matt Damon says he's going to do it, says he's not going to do it. He said all the way through, it's always an if and a maybe, and then suddenly you're there and the movie's been made and it's been successful. And but there wasn't a time when you ever sat back and said, "Oh, we did it." We were clinking the champagne glasses and saying that we won.
yeah, and you always feel pressure because you're like, okay, so the investors that came into our seed and Series A round, when we were raising, a few $100,000, we're now $1 billion company and we've done these things and we've taken these products, but we have, investors that come in all the time. So I always feel that, um, motivation to make sure everybody's happy. The new
Hmm.
investors are just as happy as the ones that came before them. So that does feel a little bit like you're never going to make everyone happy. There's always somebody else in the future.
Yeah, someone bigger. Just in the interest of time, again, this time's gone really quickly. Where do you get your kind of inspiration from? The books that you'd recommend to anyone, or readings, or things to watch, or
I used to read a lot of books. I think that I don't read as much as I used to, and I think part of that has to do with just being able to focus attention and really get into a book. But I do really like um, books that explore philosophy and the whole concept of why we exist and what we're here to do. I really enjoyed the book The Monk and the Philosopher, where there's this Buddhist monk, and he's having a debate with his father, who's a philosopher, who's very much atheist, agnostic, about the meaning of life. And I think that was a really interesting book. And I think for a CEO or for people in the industry, just to ground yourself in what are we
mm,
here for? What are we trying to do?
mm. Yeah, no, I think that sense of purpose, or having a vision connected to purpose, is absolutely the key to that. So, if you were to kind of summarize your ambitions for 5 years time, where do you see you and PureTech?
Well, we're building a major biopharmaceutical company. So that's my vision. And
Hmm.
I think we're well on our way to doing that. And I think the future biopharma companies are going to look a lot more like PureTech than like Pfizer. So that's
Hmm.
my
Yeah, it's a big bet. Yeah, and I think that certainly seems to be the direction, right? Yeah, excellent. And my last question: is there anything that you wished I'd asked you that I didn't on the way through?
No, I think those questions were great, and I've enjoyed talking to you. I think that we're in a really interesting time, and I'm excited to be in this industry. I think it's a great opportunity for us as an industry to show what we can do,
Hmm.
and I hope that science continues to permeate and that people listen to scientists. I concerned a little bit about backlash against science that's happening in the popular
Hmm.
press, in the media, and even in I think we talked about this before, even in our own friend and family circles. So it's enough to inspire all of us, I think.
For sure. Well, Daphne, thank you so much. If people want to find out more about you or about PureTech, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yes, so our website, puretechhealth.com. We have a Twitter feed for the business. Again, PureTech H, and then I'm on Twitter. But I typically just, share my own opinions there. So
that's perfect way to use it. Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Definitely, thank you so much for your time, and good luck with the next few months and the next few years.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure as always.